Assalamu alaikum. Back to the Iftar Drive with your host. My name is Lukman Skink. And of course, today being the 27th of April in South Africa, it's Freedom Day. It's the day that the very first non-racial elections took place. The day before, in fact, it was the first day that the South African flag flew. And it's the day that South Africans mark as the beginning of their freedom. Now, Nelson Mandela was voted in as the first democratic president in post-apartheid South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was the father of this nation, South Africa. And of course, a very, very important quote from Nelson Mandela on this day. We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Now, we want to talk about that. And joining me is a long-standing activist and current national coordinator of the South African BDS Coalition. And that is Roshan Dadoo. Roshan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, and welcome to the program.
Hello, and thanks for having us on the show.
You are absolutely welcome. Thank you very much, Roshan. So on today's day, I think the 27th of April, everybody conjures up the images of those long queues when South Africa had its first democratic election. And, but many forget about what Nelson Mandela said about the Palestinians, that we cannot be truly free until Palestine is free as well. And the conversation that we're hearing today, 28 years after South Africa's freedom, is South Africa really free, or are we not?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, although we have formally got rid of apartheid, and I think it's important to remember what apartheid was like for us here in South Africa. And in a way, looking at what's happening in Palestine might also help us to realize that we have come a long way. But of course, we see very many unfree things still. The legacy of apartheid that lingers in South Africa, particularly economic discrimination that continues here.
It's a conversation that we can have until the cows come home, isn't it, Roshan? Whether or not South Africa is free or truly free. But let's hone in on that quotation, that statement by the late Nelson Mandela, saying that South Africa can never be truly free until Palestine is free too. And it's something that the freedom fighters of this country, or the people that earned the freedom of South Africa, they held very closely to their heart, the freedom of Palestine. Do you think the average South African knows that our freedom is somewhat connected to that of the Palestinians?
I don't think enough people know, and I think possibly not enough people, especially younger people, know how apartheid affected us in South Africa, and how to a large extent, though, the problems we face today are connected to that, and the fact that we are not yet truly free. But I think it's also, if we remember Madiba's words, it's a very profound statement, because he points to the fact that, in effect, as long as there is apartheid, as long as there is colonialism, settler colonialism, racism, discrimination anywhere in the world, and in particular in Palestine, it is almost impossible for us to be free in the full sense of the word, both politically and economically. And I think that leads on to looking at what apartheid Israel is doing, both in Palestine and in Africa. In Palestine, of course, I think it's so important that this year the Amnesty report and then the special rapporteur on the occupied territories have come out, as well as Human Rights Watch, so clearly defining and describing why they are calling the system of Zionism in Israel as apartheid, and that it's from the point at which the Zionist project started to eliminate Palestinians from the land in 1947, 1948, and Nakba Day is coming up on the 15th of May. And so we also need to remember that. But also it's an ongoing Nakba, as Palestinians know and have been saying. The system of apartheid is one of discrimination, and it is one of segregation, and it is one of oppression and domination by one group over another. And I think that perfectly describes apartheid in South Africa, and it's the definition within the UN Convention on the crimes of apartheid that totally fits the situation in Palestine. So the things we are seeing, the outrageous scenes this month of the occupation forces raiding the Al-Aqsa Mosque, discriminating amongst Christians. I don't know if you saw that clip of a occupation soldier to separate Palestinian Christians from visiting foreign Christians and not allowing them access to the Holy Sepulchre Church over Easter. I mean, this is apartheid, and I think if we recognize it as that, then we have to ask questions. I mean, in the continent, but also in South Africa, we do still have diplomatic relations with the Israeli state. Israel is selling weapons and all sorts of spyware technologies within the continent. It poses as coming here with these water and agri-tech developments, but we know that half the time those are not sustainable projects and not relevant or designed for mass rollout in order to really help people to get access to water or improve technologies. And we know that all of these technologies are developed through having one of the biggest militaries establishments that drives the technological development, and that the weapons and so on are tested on Palestinians and then bought by elites in our country. So in that sense, coming back to the fact that we can never be free until Palestinians are free, because it then feeds into the wars and conflicts in our continent and on repression and authoritarian regimes on our continent. So I think we can clearly see that what Madiba said in those few words, that in one way are very simple, is in fact very profound.
Absolutely. Roshan, when we talk about apartheid South Africa and how it was eventually dismantled, the international community played a very important role, didn't they? Particularly when it came to the sanctions and the BDS movement. The South African Apartheid National Party had their backs against the wall, and they had no other option than to, they were forced to, onto the negotiating table. One of the reasons for that was the BDS campaign, or at least the divestment campaign. You are one of the longest standing BDS activists in South Africa. Do you think that the BDS campaign, as we know it today, will have the impact of bringing Israel, the apartheid state of Israel, to its knees globally?
Yes, I really do. I mean, I was part of the anti-apartheid campaign in South Africa, and it was a long, hard process of just as activists today are doing here and around the world around Palestine. It takes, a long time. It's a lot of work to keep getting the message out to people. But I think that's part of the point of the BDS campaign, because you're also then able to talk to people about Palestine, about what's going on there, about why people should be supporting Palestinian people. And I think that's the other side of BDS, that the boycott, divestment and sanctions is our way, and it's the strongest weapon the international community has to support the resistance of the Palestinian people in Palestine. And we've seen, especially last year, and this year actually, the ways in which people, in spite of the efforts to segregate people, so that people in Gaza are stuck in Gaza, an open-air prison, people in the West Bank are continually harassed, homes are demolished in Jerusalem, but people within the so-called Green Line also have been protesting, Palestinians there. And I think we've seen people there also coming together across the efforts of the apartheid state to segregate them and keep them separate, and demonstrating resistance in all sorts of different ways. And so I think the BDS movement, we need to ensure that we're putting as much pressure as possible on governments to boycott and divest, and hopefully raise the issue of sanctions. We've seen how effective and how quickly that can be done with looking at how the international community has BDS Russia. It took days for UEFA and FIFA to drop Russia. Whenever it's raised with them to drop Israel, they say, no, we can't mix politics and sport. Well, they clearly can. And then we saw within a week or so how full sanctions, to a large extent, against individuals, against, taking their properties, all sorts of other sporting codes, even the cat show or something banned Russian cats. It was ridiculous. But, we've seen that it's possible to do it. We know it's effective because it did work as a way of supporting the resistance within South Africa with the liberation movements. And so I think we need to spur ourselves on and say we won't give up. We know it can be done. We know it works. And we have to, if we're going to bear that quote of Madiba in mind, for solidarity is charity. It's a two-way process. So in giving our solidarity to Palestinians, we're also helping ourselves towards a true freedom in South Africa and hopefully the rest of the world and our continent.
Absolutely. Roshan, I'm just going to ask you one last question because, it's time. We've run out of time. I want to find out from you, what do you consider the biggest threats to the BDS movement? Who's fighting against BDS in the terms of what Israel is doing, for example, in the African Union? Israel is trying to force its way into the African Union to have a seat there or to have some sort of a say there. We have the normalization, the Abrahamic Accords that are happening between Israel and other Arab countries. The biggest blow to Israel that the BDS movement does is to expose Israel for the rogue state it is, and the cruel method in which it's treating the Palestinian people. In other words, to expose the reputation for what they are. But they're also fighting back, aren't they? Do you think these normalization movement, or at least Israel's attempt to have a seat in the African Union, could pose a threat to the BDS movement?
I think that they are fighting back for sure, and they're doing it through underhand ways as well. We know with the ridiculous situation that occurred in the African Union, it was an untransparent decision. It was dealt with in a very messy and confusing way by the chair of the commission to begin with. We know that countries have objected. We know it's not a consensus position. And we know particularly South Africa has been very strong on that, as well as Algeria and Nigeria. And they are the founders and heavyweights within the African Union. So I think they're very, they didn't get their way totally. They would have liked to have put it to a vote at the most recent AU summit in order to have secured their observer status. As it happened, because of opposition, they didn't get what they wanted, but equally it was a real pity that they were allowed to remain with that status whilst a committee deals with looking at how to resolve the issue. But I think when you look at also the normalization, if you look at countries like Morocco, it's got a massive Palestinian solidarity organization there, and it's the organizations have now come together as an anti-normalization campaign. And if you see some of the pictures, I mean, that when they have demonstrations, it's really thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So I think the people of Morocco, for instance, are opposed to normalization. So I don't think in that sense Israel has won over the country. It's bribed or won over the government. In fact, with Morocco, it was the deal that was done with America that promised to recognize Morocco's rule over Western Sahara if they normalized with Israel. Again, with Sudan, the people on the ground are really angry about it. And there was the fear that they would not normalize if the military were not in charge of the government. So I think, in the one hand, we have to also see that people are aware, are opposing their governments when they normalize. But I think we have a lot more work to do. And I think particularly Christian communities in the continent, because the way in which Christian Zionism has sort of, which is a very bizarre kind of a theology, but it's cooked up by Israel to sort of have inroads within the Christian communities. And I think that's a problem, particularly in our continent, in South Africa as well, to try to unpack that for people so they see that actually, no, this is a settler colonial apartheid state, oppressing the indigenous people.
Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same Israel from the Bible, of course.
It's not the same Israel from the Bible. This is a modern state. Zionism is a political ideology, and that it underpins this racist apartheid ideology and the way that they behave.
Absolutely. Roshan, I'm going to thank you for your time. Thank you very much for talking to us. Keep up the good work, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Roshan Dadoo is a long-standing activist with the and also the current national coordinator of the South African BDS Coalition. She joins us there to discuss the similarities between the Israeli and South African apartheid on the occasion of Freedom Day in South Africa, the 27th. And of course, reminding us about the quote from Nelson Mandela that South Africa will never really be truly free until Palestinians are free too. How many South Africans today that are celebrating freedom of their country understand and know the link between their freedom and the freedom of Palestinians? Well, it's our job, isn't it, to conscientize people about the link between our freedom as a nation, as a continent, and the freedom of Palestine that are currently under the Israeli occupation. Bringing our time to 17 minutes after 5 Central African time. This is the Iftar Drive. We'll be taking a short break. We'll be back